The Duke of Ashford stood before the marble tomb, his hand pressed against the cold stone bearing his late wife's name. "My heart lies here," he whispered to the winter wind, "and here it shall remain." Yet fate, indifferent to such vows, was already weaving a different tapestry. For in 3 days' time, a carriage would arrive bearing his new Duchess, a woman he'd never met, chosen by duty alone. What he didn't know was that this stranger would shatter every wall he'd built around his grief, forcing him to choose between the ghost of his past and the fierce, living woman who refused to be ignored. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The December fog clung to Ashford Manor like a shroud, wrapping the ancient estate in layers of grey melancholy. Inside the Grand Library, Alexander Hartley, the 6th Duke of Ashford, sat motionless before a dying fire, a glass of untouched brandy in his hand. At 32, he possessed the striking features of his lineage. Dark hair touched with premature silver at the temples, sharp cheekbones, and eyes the colour of stormy seas. Yet those eyes held no warmth, only the hollow distance of a man who had stopped truly living 3 years prior. The portrait above the mantelpiece commanded the room's attention. Lady Catherine Hartley, the first Duchess of Ashford, gazed down with gentle brown eyes and a serene smile. She had been everything society deemed perfect: graceful, accomplished, devoted. Her death in childbirth, along with their son, had transformed Alexander from a devoted husband into a marble statue of duty. "Your Grace, the correspondence from London has arrived." His butler, Pemberton, entered with practiced silence, placing a silver tray on the mahogany desk. Alexander didn't turn. "Burn it." "I'm afraid, Your Grace, that would be inadvisable. The letter bears the seal of the Dowager Duchess of Thornbury." At this, Alexander's jaw tightened. His mother, the woman who had orchestrated this entire nightmare with the cold efficiency of a general planning a military campaign. 6 months ago, she had presented him with an ultimatum: remarry and secure the Ashford line, or watch the estate fall into the hands of his dissolute cousin upon his death. The entail was ironclad, the pressure from the family solicitors relentless. He had agreed, finally, on one condition: he would never meet his bride before the wedding. It would be a marriage of pure convenience, a business arrangement. No courtship, no false promises, no pretense of affection. The Dowager had found a suitable candidate, Miss Eliza Thornton, daughter of a respected but financially struggling baronet. The girl needed security. He needed an heir. It was, his mother assured him, perfectly practical. "Read it," Alexander commanded, his voice flat. Pemberton cleared his throat. "The Dowager writes that Miss Thornton will arrive on the 18th of December, 3 days hence. The wedding is scheduled for the 20th at St. Michael's Chapel on the estate grounds. She reminds Your Grace that all arrangements have been finalized and that your presence at the rehearsal dinner on the 19th is not optional." How thoughtful of her to grant me permission to attend my own wedding festivities. "There is more, Your Grace. Miss Thornton has requested, and the Dowager has approved, that she be allowed to bring her personal library and that the East Wing sitting room be converted into a study for her use." For the first time in the conversation, Alexander turned his head. "A study? It appears Miss Thornton is something of a scholar, Your Grace. The Dowager mentions her proficiency in Latin, Greek, and modern philosophy. She has published several essays under a pseudonym in academic journals." Alexander's expression darkened. This was not what he had bargained for. He had expected a meek, grateful girl who would occupy herself with needlework and social calls, leaving him to his solitude. A woman with intellectual pursuits, suggested opinions, conversation, presence, all things he had no desire to accommodate. "She may have the room," he said finally, turning back to the fire, "as long as she understands that I have no interest in discussing Aristotle over breakfast." "Very good, Your Grace." As Pemberton withdrew, Alexander rose and moved to the window. Beyond the frosted glass, the formal gardens stretched toward the family cemetery, where Catherine's tomb stood beneath an ancient oak. He visited it every morning without fail, a ritual that had become his only anchor to feeling anything at all. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparations that Alexander observed with detached indifference. The household staff, under the iron command of Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, transformed the manor from its morning stillness into something resembling celebration. Garlands appeared on staircases, silver was polished until it gleamed, and the chapel was cleaned and decorated with winter roses, white at Alexander's insistence. No colour, no joy, just duty. On the evening of the 17th, Alexander's closest friend, Lord Edmund Fairfax, arrived from his neighbouring estate. Edmund was everything Alexander was not: warm, gregarious, still capable of laughter. He had been Catherine's cousin and had mourned her loss deeply, but unlike Alexander, he had not let grief consume him entirely. "You look like death warmed over," Edmund announced cheerfully, striding into the library where Alexander had taken up his usual position. "When was the last time you slept?" "I sleep. Nightmares don't count as rest, old friend." Edmund poured himself a generous measure of brandy and settled into the opposite chair. "I've come to ensure you don't flee to the continent before the ceremony. The thought had occurred to me." "I'm sure it has. But running won't solve anything. You need an heir, Alexander. The estate needs continuity. This is the responsible choice." "Responsible?" Alexander repeated bitterly. "Yes, that's what everyone keeps telling me. Responsible to marry a stranger. Responsible to replace Catherine as if she were a broken piece of furniture." Edmund's expression softened. "No one expects you to replace Catherine. But she's gone, Alexander. And you're still here, whether you like it or not. This girl, Miss Thornton, she deserves a chance at a decent life. From what I hear, her family's situation is quite desperate. So I'm to be her saviour. How noble. You're to be her husband. There's a difference." Edmund leaned forward. "I know you've built walls around yourself. I know you think feeling nothing is safer than risking pain again. But this half-life you're living, it's not what Catherine would have wanted for you." Alexander's hand clenched around his glass. "Don't presume to tell me what Catherine would have wanted. Someone needs to, because you've forgotten that she loved you enough to want your happiness, even beyond her own life." The words hung in the air, like an accusation. Alexander stood abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, snow had begun to fall, coating the world in white silence. "I've agreed to the marriage," he said quietly. "I'll provide for the girl, give her a title, a home, anything she requires materially. But my heart is not part of the arrangement. She needs to understand that from the beginning." "Have you considered," Edmund ventured carefully, "that she might not want your heart, that she might be just as reluctant as you are?" Alexander hadn't considered it. In his mind, Miss Thornton had become a faceless obligation, a necessary inconvenience. The idea that she might have her own reservations, her own grief at being bartered into a loveless marriage, had never occurred to him. "Then we'll suit each other perfectly," he said finally. Two people bound by duty, expecting nothing, feeling nothing. But even as he spoke the words, something in his chest tightened, a premonition perhaps, or simply the last gasp of the man he used to be, warning him that nothing in life ever went according to plan. The 18th of December dawned cold and bright. Alexander avoided the main entrance entirely, taking his morning walk to Catherine's tomb as usual. He stood there for nearly an hour, his breath misting in the frozen air, speaking silently to the woman who could no longer answer. When he finally returned to the manor, Pemberton met him in the entrance hall with an expression of barely concealed concern. "Your Grace, Miss Thornton has arrived." Alexander felt his entire body tense. She wasn't expected until this afternoon. The roads were clearer than anticipated. She is currently in the drawing room with the Dowager Duchess. Of course his mother was already here, orchestrating events like a puppeteer. Alexander considered simply walking past, retreating to his chambers, but even in his grief-stricken state, he recognized the cowardice in that impulse. Very well. He moved through the familiar corridors with the grim determination of a man approaching the gallows. At the drawing-room doors, he paused, straightened his coat, and arranged his features into the mask of cold courtesy he had perfected over 3 years of social obligations he no longer cared about. Then he opened the door, and his carefully constructed world shifted on its axis. The woman standing by the window was not what Alexander had expected. Miss Eliza Thornton possessed a striking beauty that seemed almost defiant in its unconventionality. Her hair, a rich auburn that caught the winter light, was arranged simply but elegantly. Her figure, though slender, suggested strength rather than fragility, but it was her eyes, a remarkable shade of green, intelligent and assessing, that arrested him completely. She was studying a first-edition volume from his collection with genuine absorption, her gloved fingers tracing the spine with reverence. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment their gazes locked. Alexander saw something flicker across her features, surprise, perhaps, or evaluation, before her expression settled into polite neutrality that mirrored his own. Alexander, finally. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, rose from her chair with practiced grace. At 60, Margaret Hartley remained formidable, her silver hair and regal bearing commanding immediate respect. "May I present Miss Eliza Thornton? Miss Thornton, my son, the Duke of Ashford." Eliza set down the book and curtsied with perfect form, though Alexander detected a slight stiffness in the gesture. "Your Grace, thank you for welcoming me to your home." Her voice was clear, cultured, with an underlying steadiness that suggested she was not easily intimidated. Alexander bowed curtly. "Miss Thornton, I trust your journey was comfortable." "Quite comfortable, thank you." An awkward silence descended. The Dowager's eyes narrowed slightly, clearly displeased with her son's lack of warmth, but she recovered quickly. "Miss Thornton was just admiring your library, Alexander. I've told her she's welcome to make use of it whenever she wishes." "How generous of you to offer my possessions," Alexander replied coolly, then turned to Eliza. "You're welcome to the books, Miss Thornton. I rarely use the library anymore." He saw her chin lift slightly at his tone, a flash of something irritation, pride, crossing her features before she masked it. "I appreciate your generosity, Your Grace. I confess the collection is quite impressive. The 1623 First Folio of Shakespeare is particularly remarkable." Despite himself, Alexander felt a flicker of surprise. Most young ladies of his acquaintance could barely identify Shakespeare, let alone recognize the significance of a First Folio. "You're familiar with rare books? My late mother was a collector. She taught me to appreciate both the content and the craftsmanship." Eliza's voice softened slightly. "She passed 2 years ago." There was genuine grief in those words, carefully controlled but unmistakable. Alexander recognized it because he carried the same weight. For a brief moment, something almost like understanding passed between them. Two people acquainted with loss, bound together by others' machinations. Then his mother cleared her throat, shattering the moment. "Well, I'm sure you two will have ample time to discuss literature after the wedding. Miss Thornton, you must be exhausted. Mrs. Blackwood will show you to your chambers. The rehearsal dinner is tomorrow evening at 7. Alexander, I expect you to be present and civil." It was a command, not a request. Alexander inclined his head stiffly. As Eliza moved toward the door, she paused beside him. "Your Grace, I want you to know. I understand this arrangement is not what either of us would have chosen. I'll endeavor to be as unobtrusive as possible." The words should have pleased him. Instead, they stirred an unexpected irritation. Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of lavender in her wake. The following evening arrived with ominous speed. The rehearsal dinner was a small affair by aristocratic standards. Only 30 guests, mostly family and close friends of the Dowager. Alexander dressed mechanically, allowing his valet to fuss over his appearance with the detachment of a man preparing for a funeral rather than a wedding. When he descended to the formal dining room, the guests were already assembled. Eliza stood near the fireplace, wearing a gown of deep blue silk that complemented her colouring beautifully. She was speaking with Edmund, who appeared charmed by whatever she was saying, his warm laughter carrying across the room. Alexander felt an irrational surge of annoyance. He moved to join them, and Edmund turned with a welcoming smile. "Ah, there you are. Miss Thornton was just telling me about her essay on Platonic philosophy in modern governance. Fascinating stuff, truly." "I'm sure it is," Alexander said flatly. "Miss Thornton, you look well." "Thank you, Your Grace. You're very kind." There was something in her tone, a subtle edge, that suggested she found his compliment anything but kind. Before he could analyze it further, his mother announced that dinner was served. The seating arrangement placed Alexander at the head of the table with Eliza to his right, the position of honor for his bride-to-be. Throughout the meal, he maintained polite but distant conversation, answering her questions with brevity and offering nothing of himself. He noticed her growing quieter as the courses progressed, the initial spark in her eyes dimming to something more guarded. Good, he thought. Better she understand now what this marriage would be. It was during the dessert course that disaster struck. Lord Pemberton, a distant cousin and notorious gossip, had consumed rather too much wine. His voice, never particularly discreet, carried down the table. "I must say, Ashford, you've done well for yourself. A young, pretty bride to warm your bed and give you airs, though I suppose any woman would seem appealing after 3 years of celibacy and mourning, eh?" The table fell silent. Alexander's hand tightened around his wineglass, but before he could respond, Pemberton continued, oblivious or uncaring. "Of course, she'll never be what the first Duchess was. Poor Catherine. Now there was a woman of true grace and breeding. This one's pretty enough, I suppose, but rather too educated for my taste. A woman with opinions is a tiresome thing in a wife." Eliza had gone very still, her face pale but composed. Alexander should have defended her immediately, should have cut Pemberton down with the icy authority of his title. Instead, he found himself frozen, Catherine's name hanging in the air like an accusation. It was Edmund who spoke first, his voice sharp. "Pemberton, you're drunk. I suggest you—" "I'm merely speaking truth," Pemberton interrupted, warming to his theme. "Everyone knows this is a marriage of convenience. The Duke needs an heir, the girl needs rescuing from poverty. No need to pretend it's anything more. At least the first Duchess was a love match. This one's just, well, a replacement. A poor substitute for—" "Enough." Alexander's voice cut through the room like a blade. He stood, his chair scraping harshly against the floor, but the damage was done. Eliza rose as well, her movements controlled despite the tremor Alexander could see in her hands. "If you'll excuse me, I find I'm not feeling well." She walked from the room with her head high, every inch a duchess despite the humiliation. The remaining guests erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Alexander's mother looked murderous, Edmund sympathetic, and Pemberton merely confused by the reaction he'd provoked. Alexander should have followed Eliza immediately. Should have apologized, offered comfort, done something to salvage the situation. Instead, he stood frozen, torn between duty and the overwhelming desire to flee to Catherine's tomb, to the only place where he felt anything real. "Go after her, you fool," Edmund hissed, gripping his arm. But Alexander couldn't move, because Pemberton, despite his drunken tactlessness, had spoken an uncomfortable truth. Eliza was a replacement, a substitute, a living reminder that Catherine was gone, and life, indifferent to his wishes, continued regardless. "I need air," he muttered, pulling away from Edmund and striding toward the terrace doors. Behind him he heard his mother's furious voice beginning to eviscerate Pemberton, but Alexander didn't stay to listen. He walked into the December night, the cold biting through his evening clothes, and kept walking until he reached the cemetery. He sank to his knees before Catherine's tomb, his breath coming in harsh gasps. "I can't do this," he whispered to the marble. "I can't replace you. I can't pretend to feel something I don't. I can't—" But the stone offered no answers, no absolution, only cold silence and the weight of his own cowardice. Inside the manor, Eliza stood in her chambers, her maid dismissed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The sophisticated woman in blue silk looked back at her, but inside she felt like the frightened girl who'd learned her father had gambled away their estate, leaving her with a choice between destitution or a loveless marriage to a man who clearly wished she didn't exist. She had told herself she could endure it, that security and a title were worth the sacrifice of affection. But standing in that dining room, hearing herself described as a poor substitute, seeing her future husband's inability to defend her, it had crystallized a terrible truth. She was about to bind herself for life to a man who would never see her as anything more than a duty, a ghost's shadow, a necessary inconvenience. Tomorrow she would become the Duchess of Ashford, and she had never felt more alone. The wedding ceremony was a beautiful, hollow affair. St. Michael's Chapel, with its ancient stone walls and stained glass windows, provided a suitably solemn backdrop for the union of two people who barely knew each other. Eliza wore a gown of ivory silk, her auburn hair crowned with orange blossoms, and she looked every inch the perfect bride. Alexander stood beside her in formal attire, his expression carved from marble, speaking his vows with mechanical precision. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Alexander's kiss was brief and perfunctory, his lips barely brushing hers, before he pulled away. Eliza felt the coldness of it settle into her bones like winter frost. The wedding breakfast was equally strained. Alexander performed his duties as host with rigid courtesy, but he didn't look at her, didn't speak to her beyond what was absolutely necessary. When the last guest departed, and tradition dictated they should retire together, he turned to her with eyes as distant as the stars. "I've had the Duchess's chambers prepared for you in the East Wing. They adjoin the study you requested. My own chambers are in the West Wing. I trust this arrangement will be acceptable." Eliza felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she kept her voice steady. "Perfectly acceptable, Your Grace." "Alexander," he corrected automatically, though the word sounded forced. "We're married now. You should use my given name." "As you wish. Alexander." He nodded once, then turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the grand entrance hall, still wearing her wedding gown, feeling more abandoned than she had ever felt in her life. The first month of marriage was a study in loneliness. Eliza quickly learned the patterns of Alexander's existence. He rose early, visited the cemetery, took breakfast alone in his study, managed estate business with his steward, dined in solitude, and retired early. He avoided her with such systematic efficiency that she sometimes went days without seeing him, despite living in the same house. She occupied herself with the library, with long walks through the winter gardens, with correspondence to her younger sister Beatrice, who remained with their aunt in Bath. But the isolation gnawed at her. She had expected a marriage without love, but she hadn't anticipated this complete erasure of her presence. Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, was kind but formal. The staff treated her with respect, but maintained a careful distance, as if unsure whether she was truly the mistress of the house or merely a temporary guest. Only Edmund Fairfax, who visited weekly, treated her with genuine warmth. "He's not always been like this," Edmund told her one afternoon in late January, as they took tea in the drawing room. "Before Catherine died, Alexander was different, warm, engaged, full of life. Her death broke something in him." "I understand grief," Eliza said quietly, stirring her tea. "I lost my mother, and it nearly destroyed me. But I didn't punish innocent people for my loss." Edmund winced. "You're right, of course. What he's doing to you isn't fair. Have you considered leaving? Seeking an annulment?" Eliza had considered it, many times. But where would she go? Her father was dead, her family's estate sold to pay his debts. Her sister depended on her married status for social standing, and despite everything, some stubborn part of her refused to surrender. "I made vows," she said finally. "I intend to honor them, even if he doesn't." It was in early February that everything changed. A letter arrived from Bath, and Eliza's hands trembled as she read it. Her aunt, Lady Thornbury, was gravely ill. Beatrice, only 17, was alone and frightened. Eliza found Alexander in his study, interrupting his work for the first time since their marriage. He looked up with obvious surprise and displeasure. "I need to go to Bath," she said without preamble. "My aunt is dying. My sister needs me." Alexander's expression didn't soften, but he nodded. "Of course. Take the carriage. How long will you be gone?" "I don't know. Several weeks, perhaps longer." "Very well. Inform Mrs. Blackwood of your requirements." That was all. No expression of sympathy, no offer to accompany her, nothing. Eliza felt something inside her finally break. "Do you feel anything at all?" The words escaped before she could stop them. "Or did you bury every human emotion with your first wife?" Alexander's face went rigid. "That's not your concern." "I'm your wife. How is it not my concern that you treat me like a piece of furniture, that you can't even look at me without flinching? You knew what this marriage was when you agreed to it. I knew it would be without love. I didn't know it would be without basic human decency." Eliza's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. "I've tried to be unobtrusive, to respect your grief, to ask for nothing. But I'm a person, Alexander. I exist. And I'm tired of being punished for the crime of not being her." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander stood slowly, his hands braced on the desk, his knuckles white. "Get out," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Gladly." Eliza left for Bath the next morning without saying goodbye. Lady Thornbury's townhouse in Bath was elegant but fading, much like its owner. Eliza's aunt had been a beauty in her youth, a widow who had never remarried, preferring independence to a second husband's authority. Now, at 70, she lay in her bed, her breathing labored, but her mind still sharp. "Eliza, darling," she whispered, gripping her niece's hand, "you look terrible. Marriage to a duke doesn't suit you." Despite everything, Eliza laughed. "You always were direct, Aunt Agatha. No point in pretty lies when one is dying." Agatha's shrewd eyes studied her. "He's making you miserable. He's grieving. He's being a selfish fool. Grief is not an excuse for cruelty." Agatha coughed, and Eliza helped her sip water. "Listen to me, child. I've lived 70 years, and I've learned this. You cannot make someone love you, but you can refuse to diminish yourself for their comfort. You are brilliant, beautiful, and worthy of respect. If he cannot see that, the fault is his, not yours." Tears burned Eliza's eyes. "I don't know how to reach him." "Then stop trying. Live your own life. Find your own purpose. If he's wise, he'll eventually realize what he's losing. If he's not, at least you'll have built something meaningful for yourself." Agatha died 3 days later, peacefully in her sleep. Eliza mourned her with Beatrice, and together they managed the funeral arrangements. It was during this time that Eliza discovered her aunt had left her a considerable sum, not a fortune, but enough to provide independence if she chose to leave her marriage. The knowledge was both liberating and terrifying. It was also in Bath that Eliza met Dr. Julian Ashworth. He had been Agatha's physician, a man of 40 with kind grey eyes and a gentle manner. He attended the funeral and afterward called to check on the sisters' welfare. "Your aunt spoke of you often," he told Eliza over tea. "She was very proud of your intellectual accomplishments. She mentioned you'd published essays on philosophy." For the first time in months, Eliza found herself in a genuine conversation about ideas, about the subjects that had once filled her with passion. Dr. Ashworth was well-read, thoughtful, and he listened to her opinions with respect rather than condescension. "There's a literary salon that meets weekly here in Bath," he mentioned. "Several scholars, writers, and thinkers gather to discuss current ideas. Your aunt was a regular attendee before her illness. I think you'd find it stimulating." Eliza hesitated. She was a married woman now, a duchess. Was it appropriate to attend such gatherings without her husband? But then she remembered Agatha's words. "Live your own life, find your own purpose." "I'd like that very much," she said. The salon met in the home of Mrs. Penelope Hartwell, a wealthy widow and patroness of the arts. The gathering included a novelist, a historian, a mathematician, and several other educated individuals who welcomed Eliza warmly. For the first time since her marriage, she felt seen, valued for her mind, rather than her title or her ability to produce heirs. She began attending regularly. Dr. Ashworth often escorted her, their friendship deepening into something comfortable and sustaining. He never overstepped propriety, but his presence was a balm to her wounded spirit. He made her laugh, challenged her thinking, and treated her with the respect Alexander had never offered. Weeks turned into 2 months. Eliza knew she should return to Ashford Manor, but she couldn't bring herself to leave Bath. Here she had purpose, companionship, intellectual stimulation. Here she was Eliza, not just the unwanted second Duchess. She wrote to Alexander, informing him of Agatha's death and her decision to remain in Bath with Beatrice for an extended period. His response was brief. "As you wish. The estate is managing well. Take whatever time you require." No condolences, no request for her return. Nothing. It was Edmund who finally came to Bath in late April, his expression troubled as he was shown into the drawing room where Eliza was reading. "Edmund, what are you doing here?" "Checking on you. And delivering a message, though I'm not sure I should." He sat heavily. "Alexander is... well, he's not well, Eliza." Despite everything, her heart clenched. "Is he ill?" "Not physically. But he's become even more withdrawn. He barely eats, barely sleeps. He's like a ghost haunting his own house." Edmund leaned forward. "I think your absence has affected him more than he'll admit. He told me to take whatever time I required. Alexander is a proud fool who doesn't know how to ask for what he needs. But Eliza, I've known him since we were boys. I've never seen him like this, not even after Catherine died." Eliza felt torn between anger and unwanted concern. "What do you expect me to do, Edmund? Return to a house where I'm invisible, to a husband who can't bear my presence? I expect you to decide what you want, not what he wants, not what duty demands, what you want. Because right now, you're both trapped in a miserable stalemate, and someone needs to break it." After Edmund left, Eliza stood at the window, watching the Bath streets bustle with life. She thought of Alexander alone in that vast manor, surrounded by ghosts. She thought of the brief moments when she'd glimpsed something in his eyes. Pain, yes, but also a flicker of something else. Recognition, perhaps, or possibility. She thought of Dr. Ashworth's kindness, the salon's intellectual warmth, the life she was building here, and she thought of Agatha's words. "You cannot make someone love you, but you can refuse to diminish yourself." When she returned to Ashford Manor, if she returned, it would be on her own terms, not as a supplicant begging for scraps of attention, but as a woman who knew her worth. The question was, did she have the courage to demand the respect she deserved? Eliza returned to Ashford Manor on a bright morning in early May, but she was not the same woman who had left 3 months prior. The carriage that brought her carried not just her belongings, but her sister Beatrice, whom she had invited to stay indefinitely. She had also brought a resolve, forged in Bath's intellectual fires. She would no longer apologize for existing. Mrs. Blackwood greeted them with barely concealed relief. "Your Grace, how wonderful to have you home. And Miss Beatrice, welcome to Ashford Manor." Beatrice, a lovely girl of 17, with honey-blonde hair and a sweet disposition, gazed around with wide eyes. "It's magnificent, Eliza." "It's a house," Eliza replied calmly. "Nothing more, nothing less. Mrs. Blackwood, please have Miss Beatrice's things taken to the blue guest chambers near my own, and inform the Duke that I've returned. His Grace is In the cemetery, Your Grace. Of course he was. Eliza felt a familiar frustration rise, but pushed it down. Then he'll learn of my arrival when he chooses to return. In the meantime, I'd like tea served in the drawing room, for two. Over the following days, Eliza established a new routine. She took breakfast in the morning room at 8, whether Alexander appeared or not. She walked the gardens in the afternoon, often with Beatrice. She spent evenings in the library, reading or writing. She gave instructions to the staff with quiet authority, slowly claiming her position as mistress of the house. Alexander, for his part, seemed stunned by the change. The first time he encountered her at breakfast, he stopped in the doorway, staring as if she were an apparition. "Good morning, Alexander," she said pleasantly, not rising. "There's fresh coffee if you'd like some." He stood frozen for a long moment, then moved stiffly to the sideboard. They ate in silence, but it was a different silence than before. Not his imposed isolation, but her chosen peace. When he finished, he cleared his throat. I was sorry to hear about your aunt." It was the first personal thing he'd said to her in months. Eliza looked up, studying his face. He looked terrible, thinner, with dark circles under his eyes and new lines around his mouth. "Thank you. She was a remarkable woman. And your sister? She's welcome to stay as long as she wishes." "That's generous of you. She'll be here for the season at least. I intend to sponsor her introduction to society." Alexander's brow furrowed. "You're planning to go to London?" "We are planning to go to London, unless you object to your wife fulfilling her social obligations." The challenge in her tone was unmistakable. Alexander set down his cup carefully. "I haven't been to London since Catherine died." "Then perhaps it's time you returned, or I can go alone if you prefer. But I will be going." She held his gaze steadily, and something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or a grudging respect. "We'll discuss it," he said finally, and left. Edmund visited that afternoon and found Eliza in the garden with Beatrice, laughing at something her sister had said. His face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Eliza, you're back, and you must be Miss Beatrice. Edmund Fairfax at your service." Beatrice blushed prettily as she curtsied. "Lord Fairfax, my sister has spoken of your kindness." "All exaggeration, I assure you." Edmund turned to Eliza with warm approval. "You look well. Bath clearly agreed with you." "Bath reminded me of who I am," Eliza replied, "something I'd begun to forget." Over tea, Eliza told Edmund about the literary salon, about Dr. Ashworth and Mrs. Hartwell, about the intellectual community she'd discovered. Edmund listened with interest, occasionally glancing toward the house where Alexander had shut himself in his study. "He's been impossible since you left," Edmund said quietly, when Beatrice had wandered off to examine the roses. "Worse than after Catherine died, if you can believe it. I think he finally realized what he'd lost." "I'm not lost. I'm right here. The question is whether he's willing to see me. Give him time. He's not accustomed to women who stand their ground." "Then he'd better become accustomed quickly. I'm not going anywhere, but I'm also not going to beg for basic courtesy." The turning point came 2 weeks later. The Dowager Duchess arrived unannounced, sweeping into the manor with her usual imperious authority. She found Eliza in the library, working on an essay. "So you've finally returned," Margaret said without preamble. "I was beginning to think you'd abandoned your duties entirely." Eliza set down her pen and rose, meeting her mother-in-law's gaze calmly. "I returned when I was ready. My aunt died and my sister needed me." "And your husband? Did he not need you?" "Your son made it abundantly clear that he neither needed nor wanted me. I chose to spend my time where I was valued." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "You're angry." "I'm done being invisible." To Eliza's surprise, the Dowager's stern expression softened slightly. "Good. It's about time you showed some spine. Alexander needs a wife, not a ghost. Catherine was lovely, but she was also compliant. Too compliant, perhaps. She never challenged him, never pushed him to be better than his grief. You want me to challenge him? I want you to be his equal, to demand the respect you deserve, to remind him that he's still alive, whether he likes it or not. Margaret moved to the window, her voice quieter. I loved Catherine like a daughter, but my son's devotion to her memory has become a prison. Someone needs to set him free. That's not my responsibility. No, but it might be your salvation, and his. Margaret turned back. I'm hosting a ball in London next month. The season is beginning. You will attend, and you will shine. Let society see that the new Duchess of Ashford is a force to be reckoned with. And Alexander? Leave Alexander to me. The Dowager's methods were characteristically direct. That evening, she cornered her son in his study and, according to Pemberton's discreet report, delivered a blistering lecture that could be heard throughout the West Wing. The next morning, Alexander appeared at breakfast, looking chastened and furious in equal measure. "It seems," he said stiffly, "that we're going to London for the season." "How delightful," Eliza replied, buttering her toast. "Beatrice will be thrilled. My mother seems to think I've been neglectful of my duties as a husband." "Your mother is perceptive." Alexander's jaw tightened. "I know I haven't made this easy for you." It was the closest thing to an apology she'd received. Eliza set down her knife and looked at him directly. "No, you haven't. You've been cruel, actually, whether you intended it or not." He flinched, as if she'd struck him. "I never meant to be cruel. Intent doesn't erase impact. You married me, Alexander. You bound me to you for life. The least you could do is acknowledge my existence." "I do acknowledge. Do you? Can you even tell me one thing about me, one thing you've learned in 6 months of marriage?" The silence stretched painfully. Alexander opened his mouth, closed it, his expression anguished. You like books. Philosophy. Everyone knows that. It's why your mother chose me." Eliza stood, her voice steady but firm. "I'll go to London because it's expected. I'll play the role of your Duchess in public. But I won't continue to be a ghost in my own home. If you want a real marriage, even just a civil partnership, you'll have to meet me halfway. If you can't do that, then we'll live separate lives under the same roof. But the choice is yours." She left him sitting there, and for the first time since their wedding, she felt powerful rather than powerless. London in the season was a whirlwind of activity. The Ashford townhouse on Grosvenor Square was opened and aired, the staff brought up from the country, and preparations made for the Dowager's ball. Eliza threw herself into the social whirl with determination, taking Beatrice to Modestis, attending afternoon calls, and accepting invitations to various events. Society was curious about the new Duchess of Ashford. The Duke's long mourning and sudden remarriage had been the subject of much speculation. When Eliza appeared at her first evening event, a musicale at Lady Pemberton's, she felt the weight of dozens of assessing gazes. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her colouring beautifully, her auburn hair dressed elegantly, Agatha's emeralds at her throat. Beatrice, in pale pink, looked lovely beside her, and Alexander, who had been essentially commanded by his mother to attend, cut a striking figure in his evening clothes, though his expression remained distant. "The Duke and Duchess of Ashford," the butler announced, and the room fell silent. Eliza walked in with her head high, her hand resting lightly on Alexander's arm. She could feel the tension in his body, see the tightness around his eyes. This was torture for him, she knew, but she refused to let his discomfort diminish her. They were immediately surrounded by well-wishers and the curious. Eliza handled each interaction with grace and intelligence, her wit and education evident in her conversation. She saw surprise and approval in many faces. This was not the meek, grateful girl they'd expected. It was during the musical performance that Dr. Julian Ashworth appeared. He had come to London for a medical conference and, upon learning of Eliza's presence, had secured an invitation through mutual acquaintances. "Your Grace," he greeted her during the interval, his warm smile genuine. "How wonderful to see you again, and in such splendid health. Dr. Ashworth, what a delightful surprise." Eliza's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Are you enjoying London?" "More so now. I was hoping I might call on you." I have some new books I thought might interest you, essays on social reform that relate to our salon discussions. I'd like that very much." She was so engaged in conversation that she didn't notice Alexander's expression darkening, didn't see the way his hands clenched at his sides as he watched another man make his wife smile in a way he never had. Edmund, standing nearby, noticed, and he smiled slightly, recognizing the first stirrings of something Alexander had thought long dead: jealousy. The game, it seemed, had finally begun. Dr. Ashworth called at the Grosvenor Square townhouse 3 days later, bringing the promised books and an invitation for Eliza to attend a lecture on social reform at the Royal Society. Alexander, who happened to be in the entrance hall when Ashworth arrived, observed the interaction with a growing sense of unease he couldn't quite name. "Your Grace," Ashworth greeted him respectfully. "I hope you don't mind my calling. The Duchess and I became acquainted in Bath through her late aunt." "Of course," Alexander replied stiffly. "My wife is free to receive whomever she wishes." But as he retreated to his study, he found himself unable to concentrate on the estate ledgers before him. He could hear Eliza's laughter drifting from the drawing room, bright and unguarded in a way it never was with him. The sound stirred something uncomfortable in his chest, not quite anger, but close. Edmund found him there an hour later, staring blankly at the same page he'd been on when Ashworth arrived. "You look like a man with indigestion," Edmund observed, helping himself to brandy. "Or jealousy. Hard to tell the difference sometimes." "Don't be absurd. Then why are you glowering at your account books as if they've personally offended you?" Alexander set down his pen with more force than necessary. "There's a man in my drawing room making my wife laugh." "Yes, Dr. Ashworth. Perfectly respectable physician, excellent reputation. He was very kind to Eliza during her aunt's illness." "How kind?" Edmund's eyebrows rose. "Ah, so it is jealousy." "It's not—" Alexander stopped, frustrated. "I have no right to be jealous. I've barely spoken to her in 6 months. I've treated her abominably. If she's found companionship elsewhere, I have only myself to blame." "True on all counts," Edmund agreed cheerfully. "So what are you going to do about it?" "What can I do? I don't know how to be what she needs." "Have you considered asking her?" The simplicity of the suggestion was almost insulting, but as Alexander sat there, he realized he'd never actually asked Eliza anything about herself, her wants, her needs. He'd been so consumed by his own grief, his own resistance to moving forward, that he'd never considered her as a person with her own desires and disappointments. "It's too late," he said quietly. "I've already lost her. She's still here, isn't she? Still wearing your ring, still bearing your name. It's only too late if you give up." Edmund leaned forward. "But I'll tell you this, old friend. If you don't act soon, you may actually lose her, because that man in your drawing room, he sees what you've been too blind to notice, and he's not bound by grief or guilt or stubborn pride." After Edmund left, Alexander remained in his study, wrestling with emotions he'd thought long buried. The truth was, he had noticed Eliza, had noticed her intelligence, her grace, her quiet strength, had noticed the way she moved through his house with increasing confidence, the way the staff had begun to genuinely respect her, the way she'd transformed from a frightened bride into a woman who knew her worth. And it terrified him, because noticing her meant feeling something, and feeling something meant risking the pain of loss again. But perhaps, he thought, the greater pain was in not risking at all. The Dowager's ball arrived with all the pomp and circumstance Margaret Hartley could command. The ballroom glittered with candlelight and jewels, filled with the cream of London society. Eliza descended the staircase in a gown of midnight blue silk that made her look like a constellation given human form, sapphires glinting at her throat and ears. The Ashford sapphires, which Alexander had sent to her room that afternoon with a brief note. "These belonged to my grandmother. She would have wanted you to wear them." It was the first gift he'd given her. Eliza had stared at the velvet box for a long time before putting them on. Alexander waited at the bottom of the stairs, and when he saw her, something in his carefully constructed armor cracked. She was breathtaking. Not just beautiful, but radiant with a confidence that seemed to illuminate her from within. "You look," he began, then stopped, unable to find adequate words. "Thank you," she said simply, taking his offered arm. "You look well yourself." They opened the ball together, as tradition demanded. As Alexander took her hand for the first waltz, he was acutely aware of how rarely he touched her, a brief kiss at their wedding, the occasional formal gesture in public. Now, with his hand at her waist and hers on his shoulder, he felt the warmth of her, the reality of her in a way he'd been avoiding for months. "You've been practicing," she observed as they moved through the steps. "I didn't want to embarrass you." How considerate. There was an edge to her tone, a reminder that one dance and a gift of jewels didn't erase months of neglect. Alexander deserved that. He knew he did. "Eliza, he began, but the music swelled, and the moment was lost. After their obligatory dance, Eliza was claimed by a succession of partners. Alexander watched from the sidelines, nursing a glass of champagne and feeling increasingly out of place at his own mother's ball. He saw Dr. Ashworth arrive and make his way directly to Eliza, saw her face light up in welcome, saw them dance together with an ease that spoke of genuine friendship. "She's quite something, your Duchess," a voice said beside him. Alexander turned to find Lord Hartwick, an old acquaintance, watching Eliza with open admiration. "Beautiful, intelligent, charming. You're a lucky man, Ashford." "Yes," Alexander said quietly, "I am. Though I must say, if you don't pay her more attention, someone else will. Ashworth's been quite attentive, I've noticed, and he's not the only one. Half the men here are half in love with her already." The words struck Alexander like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on his own grief, his own resistance, that he hadn't considered that Eliza might not wait forever, that she might find someone who actually appreciated her, who made her laugh, who saw her as more than a duty or a replacement. The thought of losing her, truly losing her, sent a jolt of something sharp and painful through his chest. It was near midnight when Alexander finally managed to catch Eliza alone on the terrace. She stood at the balustrade, looking out over the garden, her wrap pulled close against the cool night air. "You'll catch cold," he said, approaching carefully. "I needed air. It's stifling inside." He removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders. She looked surprised, but didn't refuse it. "You're the success of the evening," he said. "Everyone is talking about the brilliant new Duchess of Ashford." "Are they? How nice." Her tone was neutral, giving nothing away. Alexander took a breath, forcing himself to say what needed to be said. "I owe you an apology. More than one, actually. I've treated you unconscionably. You deserved better. You deserve better." Eliza turned to face him, her expression guarded. "Why now, Alexander? Why apologize now after months of indifference?" "Because I've been a coward. Because I've been so afraid of betraying Catherine's memory that I didn't realize I was betraying you and myself." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with his own inadequacy with words. "I thought if I didn't let myself feel anything, I couldn't be hurt again. But all I've done is hurt you, and I'm sorry, truly sorry." "I appreciate the apology," Eliza said carefully. "But apologies don't erase what's happened. They don't rebuild trust that was never built in the first place. I know I can't undo the past 6 months. But I'm hoping that you might give me a chance to do better, to be better." Eliza studied him for a long moment, and Alexander felt as if she were seeing straight through to his soul, weighing his sincerity, measuring his worth. "What changed?" she asked finally. "What made you suddenly decide I'm worth your attention?" The question was fair, if painful. Alexander could have lied, could have offered pretty words. Instead, he chose honesty. "I saw you with Dr. Ashworth. I saw you laughing with him, comfortable with him, and I realized that I was losing you, that I might have already lost you, and the thought of that..." He paused, surprised by the intensity of his own emotion. It terrified me. So, this is about jealousy? About possession? No. Yes. I don't know. Alexander moved closer, his voice dropping. All I know is that for 6 months I've been sleepwalking through life, telling myself I was honoring Catherine's memory. But tonight, watching you shine, watching other men see what I've been too blind to acknowledge, I woke up and I realized that you're not a replacement for Catherine. You're not a duty or an obligation. You're Eliza, and I've wasted 6 months of knowing you. Tears glinted in Eliza's eyes, but she blinked them back. Pretty words, Alexander, but I need more than words. I need actions. I need consistency. I need a partner, not a ghost who occasionally remembers I exist. I know, and I'm asking for a chance to prove I can be that. Not immediately. I know I don't deserve your trust yet, but over time, if you're willing. Eliza was silent for so long that Alexander thought she might refuse. Then, slowly, she nodded. "One chance," she said firmly. "I'll give you one chance to show me you mean what you say. But Alexander, if you retreat back into your grief, if you shut me out again, I won't wait. I won't spend my life begging for scraps of affection from a man who can't let go of the past." "I understand." "Do you? Because I need you to know. I'm not Catherine. I'll never be Catherine. I'm stubborn and opinionated, and I won't be silent when I disagree with you. I won't be a decorative Duchess who smiles and nods and asks for nothing. If you want a real marriage with me, it will be messy and complicated and sometimes difficult." For the first time in months, Alexander felt something like hope stirring in his chest. "I don't want a decorative Duchess. I want—" He paused, then said with quiet intensity, "I want to know you, the real you. I want to hear your opinions even when they challenge mine. I want to understand what makes you laugh, what makes you angry, what you dream about. I want a chance to earn your respect and maybe someday your affection." Eliza's expression softened slightly. "That's a start." From inside, the music swelled, and Alexander extended his hand. "Dance with me? Not because tradition demands it, but because I'm asking, because I want to." After a moment's hesitation, Eliza placed her hand in his. They returned to the ballroom, and as they moved through the waltz, something had shifted between them. Not love, not yet, but possibility. A tentative bridge across the chasm that had separated them. Dr. Ashworth, watching from across the room, smiled slightly and quietly took his leave. He was a good man, and he recognized when his presence was no longer needed. As the ball wound down and guests began to depart, Alexander found himself reluctant to let Eliza go. At her chamber door, he paused. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me another chance. I won't waste it." See that you don't," Eliza replied, but there was a hint of warmth in her voice that hadn't been there before. As Alexander walked to his own chambers, he felt lighter than he had in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He had months of damage to repair, trust to rebuild, a relationship to forge from almost nothing. But for the first time since Catherine's death, he wanted to try, wanted to live, not just exist. And it was all because of the woman he'd almost lost through his own stubborn blindness. 6 months had passed since the Dowager's ball, and Ashford Manor had transformed from a mausoleum of grief into something resembling a home. The change had been gradual, built on small moments and consistent effort, but it was undeniable. Alexander had kept his promise. The morning after their conversation on the terrace, he had appeared at breakfast and asked Eliza about her plans for the day. A simple question, but it had marked the beginning of a new pattern. He began taking meals with her regularly, asking about her reading, her correspondence with Beatrice, who had made a successful match with a kind young baronet, and her thoughts on estate matters. At first, Eliza had been cautious, waiting for him to retreat back into his shell. But Alexander persisted. He asked Mrs. Blackwood to consult Eliza on household decisions. He invited her to accompany him on rides through the estate. He sat in the library while she worked on her essays, not speaking necessarily, but present. choosing to be near her. The breakthrough had come one evening in late summer. They had been reading in companionable silence when Alexander suddenly closed his book and said, "Tell me about your mother." Eliza had looked up, surprised. "My mother? You mentioned she taught you to love books. I'd like to know more about her, about you." And so Eliza had told him about her mother's wit and warmth, about the hours they'd spent in their modest library discussing philosophy and literature, about the grief of losing her and the subsequent unraveling of her family's fortunes. Alexander had listened without interruption, and when she finished, he had shared his own stories of Catherine, but differently than before. Not as a shrine to be worshipped, but as a memory to be honored and then gently set aside. "She was wonderful," he had said quietly, "but she's gone, and I'm here, with you, and I'm beginning to think that's not a betrayal of her memory, but rather a different kind of love, one she would have wanted for me." It was the first time he'd acknowledged that moving forward didn't mean forgetting, and Eliza had felt something in her chest loosen, a knot of resentment and hurt beginning finally to untangle. Now, in the crisp October air, Eliza stood in the garden overseeing the planting of new rose bushes. Alexander approached from the house, carrying 2 cups of tea, a small gesture that had become routine. "Mrs. Blackwood said you'd been out here for hours," he said, handing her a cup. "You'll freeze." "I'm nearly finished. I wanted these planted before the first frost." She accepted the tea gratefully, her fingers brushing his. Such small touches had become more frequent, more natural. "Thank you. What variety are you planting?" "Autumn damasks. They'll bloom late in the season, and the scent is extraordinary. I thought they'd be lovely near the terrace." Alexander looked at the garden with new eyes. When Catherine had been alive, she'd preferred formal arrangements, everything precise and controlled. Eliza's garden was different, still beautiful, but wilder, more vibrant. Like Eliza herself. "It's beautiful," he said. "You've transformed this place." "We've transformed it," Eliza corrected gently. "You've done as much as I have." It was true. Alexander had begun making changes of his own. He'd had Catherine's portrait moved from the library to a private sitting room, still honored, but no longer dominating every space. He'd started hosting small gatherings again, reopening the manor to neighbors and friends. He'd even laughed, genuinely laughed, at one of Edmund's terrible jokes last week. "I received a letter from the Royal Society," Eliza mentioned as they walked back toward the house. "They've accepted my essay on women's education for publication, under my own name this time, not a pseudonym." Alexander stopped, turning to face her with undisguised pride. "Eliza, that's extraordinary. Congratulations. There will be talk, of course. A Duchess publishing academic work is still considered rather scandalous in some circles. Let them talk. I'm proud of you. Your mind is one of your greatest gifts. Why should you hide it?" The words, so simple yet so meaningful, brought tears to Eliza's eyes. This was what she'd needed all along, not grand gestures or passionate declarations, but respect, partnership, someone who saw her fully and valued what he saw. "Thank you," she whispered. Alexander reached out, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear in a gesture of surprising tenderness. "No, thank you, for not giving up on me, for being patient when I didn't deserve it, for being exactly who you are." Their relationship had grown slowly, carefully, like the roses Eliza planted. There had been setbacks, days when Alexander's grief resurfaced and he withdrew, moments when Eliza's old hurt made her defensive, but they had learned to talk through difficulties rather than retreating into silence. They had learned to be honest, even when honesty was uncomfortable. And gradually, something neither had expected began to bloom: genuine affection. It was in November, during a particularly fierce storm, that everything changed. Eliza had been reading in the library when the wind shattered one of the ancient windows, sending glass and rain cascading into the room. She had cried out in surprise, and Alexander had come running from his study, his face pale with fear. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, pulling her away from the broken window, his hands running over her arms, checking for injuries. "I'm fine, just startled." But Alexander wasn't listening. He pulled her against him, holding her tightly, his heart pounding against her cheek. "When I heard you scream, I thought—" His voice broke. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you." Eliza pulled back enough to look up at him, and what she saw in his eyes took her breath away. Not duty, not obligation, but raw, genuine fear at the thought of losing her. "Alexander," she said softly, reaching up to touch his face. "I'm all right. I'm here." He caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek, his eyes closing. "I love you," he said, the words seeming to surprise him as much as her. "God help me, I love you, not because I should, not because you're my wife, but because you're you, because you're brilliant and stubborn and brave, because you challenged me when I needed it most, because you made me want to live again." Eliza felt tears streaming down her face. "I love you too. I've been trying not to, trying to protect myself, but I do. I love you." When Alexander kissed her, it was nothing like their brief, perfunctory wedding kiss. This was real, deep, full of months of longing and restraint, finally released. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "I think," Alexander said with a slight smile, "that we should probably see about fixing that window." Eliza laughed, the sound bright and free. "Practical as always, Your Grace. Someone has to be when my wife is busy revolutionizing academic publishing and redesigning gardens." "Your wife?" Eliza repeated, testing the words. "I think I'm finally beginning to feel like your wife." "Good, because I'm finally beginning to feel like your husband." The winter that followed was the happiest either had known. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other, debating philosophy, planning improvements to the estate. Alexander began attending Eliza's literary salon when they were in London, contributing his own insights and clearly proud to be associated with his wife's intellectual circle. In February, Eliza discovered she was with child. The news brought complicated emotions for Alexander: joy, but also fear, memories of Catherine's death in childbirth rising like ghosts. Eliza, seeing his struggle, took his hand and said firmly, "I'm not Catherine. This is not the same story. We write our own ending." And she was right. When their daughter was born in late September, a healthy, squalling infant with auburn hair and her father's grey eyes, Alexander wept with relief and joy. They named her Catherine Agatha, honouring the past while embracing the future. 2 years later, standing in the garden Eliza had created, watching his wife play with their daughter while their infant son slept in his cradle nearby, Alexander marvelled at how completely his life had transformed. The man who had sworn his heart was buried with his first Duchess had discovered that hearts, like gardens, could bloom again if given the right care. Edmund, visiting for tea, found Alexander in this contemplative mood and grinned. "You look disgustingly happy." "I am," Alexander admitted without shame. "Disgustingly, completely happy. I remember when you insisted you'd never feel anything again. I was a fool." "Yes, you were, but you were wise enough to recognize it before it was too late." Edmund watched Eliza lift Catherine into the air, the child's laughter ringing across the garden. "She's extraordinary, your Duchess." "She is, and the remarkable thing is she always was. I was just too blind to see it." Inside the house, in the private sitting room, Catherine's portrait still hung, but it no longer dominated. It shared space with a new portrait, one of Eliza holding baby Catherine, her expression serene and joyful. 2 duchesses, 2 loves, 2 chapters of one man's life, not in competition, but in harmony. That evening, after the children were asleep, Alexander and Eliza stood on the terrace where they'd had their pivotal conversation 2 years prior. The autumn roses Eliza had planted were in full bloom, their scent perfuming the air. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander asked quietly, "agreeing to marry me, those first terrible months?" Eliza considered the question seriously. "I regret the pain, but I don't regret the outcome. We had to go through the darkness to reach this light. And this," She gestured to the house, the garden, the life they'd built. This is worth every difficult moment. Alexander pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. I vowed my heart was buried with my first Duchess. I was wrong. It wasn't buried, it was dormant, waiting for someone brave enough to awaken it. Your defiance awakened an unwanted flame, Eliza quoted with a slight smile, remembering those early days of conflict and resistance. Not unwanted anymore, Alexander murmured. Never unwanted again. They stood together as the sun set over Ashford Manor, two people who had found each other in grief and duty and forged something far more precious. A love built on respect, partnership, and the courage to bloom where they were planted. The past would always be part of them. Catherine's memory, Agatha's wisdom, the losses that had shaped them. But the future stretched ahead, bright with possibility, filled with children's laughter and intellectual debates and quiet moments of connection. Alexander had learned that love wasn't a finite resource, that honoring one love didn't preclude finding another, and Eliza had learned that demanding respect and refusing to diminish herself had been the greatest gift she could give both of them. Together, they had written a new story, not of replacement or second chances, but of transformation, of two wounded people who had healed each other, not by forgetting the past, but by choosing every day to build a future together. And in the garden, the autumn roses bloomed, their beauty all the more precious for arriving late in the season, proving that the most extraordinary things often come when we least expect them, if only we're brave enough to let them grow. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Your support means everything, and I'd love to know how far this tale of love, loss, and second chances has traveled. Until next time, may you find the courage to bloom wherever you're planted.